Zero Energy Building Knowledge Series. We bring to you weekly webinars on energy efficiency related projects, technology, tools, ideas, concepts, policies, and various things that leads to net zero energy design. This program is supported by USAID under the METRI program. METRI stands for Market Integration and Transformation for Energy Efficiency. You can know more about the program on our website, metri.etsglobal.com. So today we are going to talk about a very interesting project for IIT Jodhpur. This is a campus master plan. It is an example of large-scale net zero development. A little bit about me. My name is Deepa. I'm an architect and a green building consultant, and I will be the session moderator for today's webinar. And today we have the expert speaker, architect Sanjay Prakash. Most of you already know him and he really needs no introduction, but for everybody's information, I'd like to introduce him. He's the principal consultant of his design firm, Shift, Studio for Habitat Futures. He is a co-founder of the Future Institute, a not-for-profit, multidisciplinary, applied research platform seeking to undertake and enable initiatives towards informing how India shapes its urban future. An architect with a commitment to energy-conscious architecture and eco-friendly design, his area of practice and research over the last 30 years includes passive and low-energy architecture and planning, hybrid air conditioning, autonomous energy and water systems, bamboo and earth construction, community-based design of the common property, and also computer-aided design. Like always, I like to just brief you a little bit about the project, and then Sanjay Prakash will walk you through the entire project in detail. IIT Jodhpur is a 860-acre university campus located in the hot and dry desert climate of Jodhpur in Rajasthan. This is a winning competition entry, and the construction is currently ongoing, and this is planned in phases. Why are we talking about this project? It's always good to have a little orientation. While in this case, it's pretty self-explanatory, I'd like to just reiterate that, as you can see from some of the images that you may have already seen in the past on social media or our emails, that the concept is inspired by traditional desert settlements. But yet the project team has employed innovative design thinking to arrive at a blueprint for a large-scale net zero development. In fact, it's not just energy. It also integrates aspects of biodiversity, water, food, energy, waste, even ICT, and mobility that is integral to such a large-scale development. And so this project is a perfect candidate to talk about, to learn about, and to see what kind of innovative thinking has gone into developing this master plan guidelines. So without further delay, I will now request Sanjay Prakash to lead the presentation from this point.
Hi, thank you, Deepa. Hello. Hello. Thank you, Deepa. So I'm hoping, I don't know how long this will take, but I'm going to walk you through the various aspects of the work that we did for IIT Jodhpur in the last 5, maybe 6, 7 years, and give you an idea of how we approached the issue. To begin with, the RFP of this project required us to make this a zero energy settlement. It would have a population of 15,000 people. So if you do a thumbnail calculation, you'll find that about 20-25% of the area is required for generating a low amount of solar energy, which would be sufficient for having a fully air-conditioned campus. And when I say low amount of energy, we are probably talking about 50, 60 kilowatt hours per square meter a year. Uh, and it also, I think, even more governing was the constraint of water. Besides net zero energy, this campus wanted to be a campus which had near zero water demands, at least after 10, 15, 20 years. And this, of course, needs to be proved later whether it's happened or not. But clearly, thank you. So clearly, the amount of rain is sufficient to just about support a population of 15, 16 to 16, 17,000 people using not 135 but maybe 60 to 80 liters of water per capita per day if you consider the amount of rain that falls and try and harvest every drop. So these are some of the issues that we started out with. And how do I change the slide? Okay. How did you do that? Okay. So this is Jodhpur. This is, of course, the old town of Jodhpur, which was established some 500 years ago, and it's called the Blue City because in order to get over the problems of termites and general sanitation, the whitewash was often mixed with the ultramarine, the Neil or the blue tint comes from there. And this was light enough to reduce the heat and therefore, and also maybe to create a kind of better ambience and lower amount of heat as well as a lower amount of termites and insects. People started using this color, and so this is a picture taken from top of Marangarh Fort, which is the old fort built about 500 years ago. And you can see that the city has a character which is a blue character. Interestingly enough, the migratory birds that come from Siberia, which are on the left of this picture, also have practically the same color. I mean, that's a coincidence because I don't think the two pictures really have any relationship to each other, but still, that's an interesting thought. So this is the view from top of Mehrangarh Fort, and you can see that the blue is not as dramatic as in the earlier picture. That's because this is the realistic color, and that last picture there was, I think, a small portion which is more blue than most other places. But the blue element of water has been a very important part of the way Jodhpur has been worked out. So I suppose when our forefathers of the Mewar kingdom established the fort there, they used a hill, the Mehrangarh hill, to create. See, there was energy was not that important as water was because water is the life-giving element, and therefore they created a series of water management systems within the Jodhpur hill which are somewhat alive even to this day, even though today the problem, if I can call it a problem, is that the water tends to come from a canal, the Indira Gandhi Canal, and by pipe. And therefore, there is a tendency for the existing traditional water systems to be ignored. So this diagram on top shows in section the way that the water management worked. There was something called the Ranisar Padmasar Canal, which led to the Ranisar Lake, which was actually rain fed, and then the lake and its seepage, because in the old days there wasn't the kind of tendency to use concrete, which can cause incidentally a lot of damage to the ecosystem if used today. But anyway, there was no plastic or concrete to use in the lake, so it was using clay and rock, and the seepage of that started generating water into the city of Jodhpur, which you will just see. So at the bottommost of this ecosystem of water is the well. So this is a scene from Jodhpur market, and the well has now been overgrown with a tree and with all kinds of shrines around it and so on. But this used to be, and even today is, full of water, and people can walk up to it and take some water for their personal use from this well. Funnily enough, because of the success of these water harvesting systems, Jodhpur has a problem of having an excess of groundwater. So this seems unbelievable, but it's true that people who make basements in Jodhpur are forever moaning that there is a problem in retaining the seepage because there's so much groundwater today that they don't know what to do with it. So, well, so this is the well to begin with, and this is a version of the well called the Bauli, which is a traditional way of, instead of dropping a bucket down to the water, you walk down to the water and fill your bucket or ghada or whatever with water and walk up. And this kind of a system is very interesting because it's, as you can see, it's very pretty, it's very well crafted. It's also a great social space because women who would go to fill water traditionally would sit and gossip on these steps and be able to exchange notes, and the social lubrication in a sense was made possible through the Bauli. On the right you see Jhalada. A Jhalada is nothing but a Bauli with three side steps, and the fourth side, which is very interesting, is uh, in this case it's a theater. It's actually a two-story theater where on the right you can imagine that the queen must have sat, and on the left there would be performers who would perform. And it's a great kind of theater because you see the water in the foreground and you see the theater in the background. So this is called a Jhalada. Then there is of course a step well, which is a four-sided Bauli, so that you can have people from all four sides going down to the bottom, collecting their water and going up again. And these have, in the whole Rajasthan Gujarat belt, become very famous even today as examples of great medieval architecture. Finally, you have a tank, which is, this is part of Jodhpur town today. In the background on the left, you see the Mehrangarh Hill. And lastly, you have the Ranisar Lake, which is actually a man-made lake, which is made by pushing some boulders on a place where otherwise water would have flown down, I mean, trickled down, but instead it makes a lake. Now, the brief that we had was in sense of water, very simple and very complex, and it was very daunting. So here is the brief. This is a picture of the site, and this is how it was 7 years ago when we found it. And this is a picture. The next one is a picture from Jodhpur city, and it's from Ranisar, and you see that essentially the brief is saying that we would like this site, this one, to transform to this, which is say this one. And what a crazy brief! And is it possible? Well, it is possible because both these pictures are taken from Jodhpur. It so happens that one is from our site, 23 kilometers out of Jodhpur, and one is from Jodhpur itself, from the Mehrangarh Fort. And clearly something can be done, and since we don't have a hill, we need to utilize the smallest of slopes that we can get to be able to harvest water. So here is our site, and you will see now a clearer view of the way it is. 860 acres, bifurcated by National Highway 65, which goes to northwest, and therefore could be grown in order to create a water surplus in the root zones. So here is the khejri tree, the famous one, which a lot of people in Jodhpur know about it, of course. It doesn't really yield too much fruit, but it has some berries which are used by various birds. So it also acts as a habitat for various local avifauna. You can also see in this next picture, uh, which is again from the site, how at one point people have quite desperately um, tried to create water canals. So you see a water canal made of sandstone, which is making use of the slightest slope that we have on site, which is little hill on both the left and the right hand side of the site. And the rain that falls on this is probably collected up in a small rainwater collection area and then at a suitable time fed to the fields in order to irrigate the very meager kind of cultivation that must have happened. So when we started working on this, we were conceiving of how to work with this, and so we decided that our best conceptual approach would be to not build against the desert, but build with the desert. And it's a subtle difference, but you can see that when we build against the desert, we try to create an allopathic sense of a human being very powerful and therefore setting their foundations down. When you build with the desert, you want to make use of every little sand dune, every little tree and shrub that grows on site, and use whatever rainwater falls. It's a policy to think that these desert areas have very little rain. Yes, deserts are defined as having less than 15 centimeters of rain per year, but there is in the monsoon a reasonably good amount of rain in Jodhpur. So it is not as arid as, say, Pokhran, Jaisalmer, or other parts of the Thar Desert would have been. Where personally I would not know exactly how to even establish a population of 15,000 in so much area. You probably need to do it with much lower density there. These are 6 visuals which show the development of the way the plan worked out. So we said that, well, this is a national highway in between. We conceptualize the site like a rectangle, which is shown in the upper left view. And this is the direction of the winds. And therefore, we start making a number of densely built settlements, each with its own character. And we build it in phases. And we took this inspiration, incidentally, of a dense desert settlement from the area of Nagaur, which is, of course, on the right-hand side of this view, some 40 kilometers away. Nagaur is a typical desert town. And if you look at Google image of parts of Nagaur, you will see buildings stacked close to each other, east-west direction of streets that helps to avoid the wind, which is extremely hot and carries sand. It also helps to provide a shadow so that you can walk between buildings in the shade and not feel the heat of, except in the midday for a little short while, maybe half an hour. Except in midday, you can walk in the east-west streets in the shade and be relatively cool. Of course, it also helps that you can plant these streets and have a little bit of vegetation, which through transevaporation will further cool these streets, and so on. So you see that there are a variety of ideas that we developed, and these were combined. I think one of the most major one was in the bottom left picture, which is the idea of the berm, which is like an earthen dike to deflect the wind. And if you deflected the winds, you also deflected sands and you also deflected the heat reasonably. So we did a CFD analysis of this later and we found that it was very sensitive to the exact height and width and so on. But anyway, so this was the conceptual idea in which clustered small compact desert settlements were to be laid out over the entire site, built in phases, and the dikes, large ones and small ones, would deflect the hot winds. On the north, which you'll see in the fifth view, in the bottom center, was left sufficient area for a large grid of trees and shrubs for natural forests and fields. Uh, so we called these clusters johars because initially we imagined that they would be the equivalent of the village pond, which you see in the upper left view. In the final development, they're not really like that. They're not ponded, but clearly they still serve the purpose of protection. So we call them the new johars, and these are early views, conceptual views. And at the bottom left, you see a kind of developed view of the first master plan, which was how we presented it during what was it, 2012, and we entered the competition. This is a CFD analysis of the way the largest cluster works, and depending on the velocity profile of the wind at whatever 4.5, 5 meters per second, 10 meters, and 20 meters, you have in section in the views below a variety of temperatures and wind speeds that you can see, which basically shelter the whole settlement. Turns out that this main berm needs to be 12 meters in height at the center, and that's a lot of height, but nevertheless, this was done, and tapering down to the ground level along the sides. Where do we get the material for this berm? So initially, the idea was to do a lot of basements, which were then negated at some point during the development because of, should we say, issues of security, especially for women students. And when that went out, we had to create spaces which could be used as additional parking spaces and students' activity spaces, etc., in the berm so as to reduce the soil. And then we haven't really bought any soil, but it's true that it's in a costly structure, so that's the way it is. This is an important slide, and I'd like you to see the clustering. So on the upper left is IIT Jodhpur, the way we've designed it. On the other three views are three other IITs. So you'll see that IIT Mandi is kind of dense and clustered, but it's so because it's on a hillside, and the site slopes westward towards the Khad river, and therefore all the buildings also kind of go north-south and look westward. It's not necessarily the best oriented, but IIT Jodhpur at least has the advantage that there's some relatively plain land, therefore we can have completely south-oriented and north-oriented buildings. You see two older IITs also on this view. IIT Kanpur on the top right, which is about the same size as IIT Jodhpur, has over the years developed into a classical 20th century plan, whereby there was a squarish shape in the middle, which was the academic area, and then it is kind of sprawled in various directions. But the important difference between these two is that you see that there is nothing containing these settlement except the boundary itself. So when this happens, the whole development becomes like a flotilla of ships on a piece of water, meaning that they all have 3, 4, 5 stories, whatever their height is, and they have certain gaps between them. Typically, they have trees in those gaps, and then you really need to invest a lot of water and energy to keep them cool and to keep them vegetated. So something like IIT Kanpur and a similar kind of approach in IIT Delhi, which you see at the bottom, show you how different this approach is. And this is central to IIT Jodhpur and its thinking that, and this is inspired by Nagaur and other compact desert villages, that this is really a village which doesn't use up, in a sense, the entire land, but instead puts the settlement in a smaller cluster, in this case 200 acres, and so 1/4 the area. And then the excess area left over is utilized for a variety of functions, such as farms, fields, forests, such as parking, such as solar fields, which I'll come to soon. So this is the way that the basic orientation and a compact basic form works. These are slides taken from a presentation made explaining the passive solar features of the whole campus layout. You'll see that this layout is somewhat different from the earlier layout I showed you. Equally compact, but slightly different in terms of its detailing, because well, what you saw earlier with the 2012 layout, what you see now is the 2016 or 17 layout, which is a little simplified. Uh, I've already talked about the narrow shaded streets. We had the possibility of making urban design guidelines, which allowed what you see at the bottom left, a kind of set of narrow streets, typically 6 to 9 meters wide, and an occasional balcony or jharoka coming out, which would shade that street. This was tough to detail out because remember, we have to, in the modern world, allow fire tender access into these streets. So that is really the determining constraint of the master planning, that ambulances and fire tenders can get into the street. Then there was a proposal which is going to be implemented to have covered public courtyards and streets, which you see in the central panel here. So you have between academic buildings, you have various kinds of streets, and they will all be covered with flags and partial coverage so that you will have the ability to walk under shade. So it will either be trees or it will be these kinds of polyvinyl fluoride membranes which will cover the street. All this gives us an interesting silhouette, and you see that I need to see this. Okay, okay, I can move it. Okay, so here I am. So this is an interesting silhouette, and can you minimize this? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So can you still see it? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So basically, this. Oops. And lastly, the colors and materials used are of a certain grade, which is partly determined by the color of sandstone available in Jodhpur, as well as the kind of natural materials we use. So most of the campus is so designed that it doesn't really require external painting. It does require internal painting because you need light colored walls, white colored walls inside to maximize daylight. And you need to reduce the amount of daylight coming in because with daylight comes heat and you don't want the heat to come. So we were able to then set out guidelines of colors, materials, and heights and such like restrictions. And this, of course, gives you an idea of the climatic conditions that were available. This is a microclimate analysis, and you see how the various buildings have a variety of solar incident solar radiation on various kinds of designs. Mostly you see courtyard buildings, and courtyards are shaded blue, which means that they are often shaded and therefore cooler, except for certain parts of the year, like 21st June, you see some of the courtyards have the red in them, but at all other times, even a few weeks before or after 21st June, they would be fairly shaded. So the fundamental idea of using east-west oriented blocks and east-west oriented roads is a sound one for practically all hot, dry climates in the subtropics that we are in, especially in latitudes of 22 to 35 degrees, which is where Jodhpur is. We then worked out where the various incident solar radiation hit the building surfaces, and it's clear that the roof is the one to watch out for. So when we developed the specifications, this whole campus is, and this is a big one, this whole campus is designed to be ECBC plus. That is to say, it's designed to have a very large amount of insulation, external insulation on the roof, so that the top floor pretty much feels like a middle floor in a building and doesn't have the typical hot roof in the evenings that is associated with such concrete structures in this climate. So when I say that this was a lot of insulation, I believe, if memory serves me right, that it was 150 mm of XPS insulation on the roof, and I think something like 100 mm on the walls. So it's a highly insulated kind of campus that we worked out. The parking, this is a pedestrian campus, which I think I did not mention before, and therefore it required a fair amount of shaded parking near the entrance and around the berm, so that the inside of that settlement would be a walkable settlement. And it would be walkable, meaning it would be 200 meters across, a little more than that, so not more than 10 minutes to walk up to any place of your choice and so on. So using trees and using solar collectors, we propose to provide ample parking under shade. Now, this diagram, which is coming up, now, is a single diagram tries to encapsulate all the systems and subsystems of the master plan. In the middle, you see, can my cursor be seen? Yeah. Okay. In the middle, you see these the actual students, which are the formal, should we say, the payload of an organization like this. That so many graduates need to be created every year, technical graduates and so on. But they have formal outcomes because besides the graduates themselves, they have global reach, they have IPR being created, they have new technology being created. There are also informal outcomes, such as local communities being trained, let's say, into making a variety of craft-based low embodied energy materials for construction, or running workshops, such as the textiles department running a workshop on leather work for jutis, which was particularly successful, and so on. Then on the left is the energy side, on the right is the water side, water and food, I should say. So on the left, you see that there are so many sources of energy where my cursor is now hovering, of energy supply. Solar in Jodhpur, of course, is very, very big because it's considered a solar city, and there is whatever, some, I think 20% of the whole 8,750 years, 40 hours of the year is considered the amount of solar radiation that can be collected at peak. So 20% at peak is about a record because there are very few areas in India that have more than that, and probably very few in the world as well. Now, these can be collected here in the field. It can also be collected on top of a roof. And besides that, there is biomass and there is some amount of wind, not a terrific amount, but still. So you get all these sources, and they have all kinds of uses, sometimes minor, sometimes major, and they all get into the building subsection, which is here, in which I've already shown you the shaded streets, I've shown you the self-shading, the orientation and the color and how it affects. And we also had the idea of the berm affecting and cooling the rooms inside it, so that there would be a kind of basement effect created by the amount of soil which is stacked over the berm. We designed this whole campus to have a variety of air conditioning types. So one would be natural, then there would be hybrid, one would be active, and one would be technology dominant, should we say. So active cooling would mean that you would have, say, 26, 27, even 28 plus minus 1 as the temperature set point, while technology dominant would make it 24 plus minus 1. So we defined a variety of buildings and spaces to have different levels of air conditioning in order to optimize them. In this section, you have a variety of intermediate technologies for mobility, for water pumping and street lights and so on, which finally feed the resident population. On the right hand side, you see that the main source here is rain. That's 300 mm of rain per year, which sounds very little, but actually is a lot of rain if you consider 860 acres of area. And even if you collect, say, 20% of that rain, which is what you can collect, I guess, um, you get sufficient to support, but at a sufficiency level, not with profligate consumption, but with good sensible consumption, you can support a population of 15,000 people. So you have traditionally the source of the Rajasthan canals. This is typically our backup now, and we hope and expect that over the years we should be able to use a smaller and smaller quantity of the Rajasthan canal water, which is expensive and which becomes quite difficult to transport because um, the transportation distance is 23 kilometers, and that itself and the salinity increases in that transportation and so on and so forth. So when we were doing this diagram, in which, by the way, connects everything to everything. So by almost, if you have more sun, then you have well, not less water, not so directly, but if you have, let's say, the demand for more people moving around more, then you have less energy or you have more energy demand. So practically everything is connected to everything, which is how good systems diagram should be, and it shows like a living system, like our human body, in which illness in one part affects every other part of the body. You can see that if I knock off any one system, sooner or later everything else will start atrophying over time. So, so this was for us a very important diagram to develop, and it took a long time to develop this, and we presented it. And to some extent, this was probably the starting point of how the jury saw that we conceptualized the whole thing, not physically, though I've shown you the physical manifestation also, but conceptually as a set of interlocking metabolism of parts. Now, while doing this, we realized that there is something which can define this DNA, if I can call it the DNA. So, like the DNA looks nothing like the organism, this DNA, this diagram, looks nothing like the physical manifestation of the campus. So, here I'm back to the sixth tactics which allow us to manage physical stocks and flows. So, the first tactic is that we have to learn to use less. This is not fashionable. We have to learn to work with 40, 50, 60 kilowatt hours per square meter per year for air conditioned buildings. You have to learn to work with 60, 70, 80 liters per capita a day for water and recycle it. And so we have to use factor 4 technologies, that is to say, lower demand and social limits of sufficiency and equity on demand. So everybody, in order for everybody to get what's required, we have to use less. And then once we use less, we have to grow our own. So growing our own simply means, in the case of Jodhpur, we grow our energy through the solar farms on the roof as well as on the floor, on the ground. And for water, we grow our own through the rain that comes in. It requires large amounts of storage, which is mostly done underground in the swales and by recharging groundwater. Incidentally, currently this area is classified as black zone, so we are not allowed to harvest our own rainwater, but we hope to have it declassified, and after that we should be able to harvest the increase of groundwater level that we would have caused. Already, just by the simple uh, intervention of having a boundary wall and therefore reducing the grazing, this land has become what you might call a grassland instead of a desert, which you saw in the first pictures. It's now a grassland. Now, once you grow your own and use less, you have to build two-way networks. This is an important fundamental point, which means that every consumer has to become a producer. So, if you get electrons, energy flowing into a wire, and feeding your device, then every time your device has an extra little battery and has sufficient energy, it should be able to plug back into the building and feed the campus. Similarly, every time a pipe gives you water to feed a toilet, you should be able to store rainwater in every building and make it available to the campus when parts are short supply. So this kind of thing can be done, and we have attempted this in a very major way. It also means you have to store a lot because renewable resource yields are diurnal and seasonal. Water is stored in underground tanks. Energy is stored in the grid. So we have a grid interactive system proposed, not yet implemented, but once the grid can be thought of like an ocean in which you can store all your excess energy and then take it back when you need it. If the grid, of course, fails, then you are in trouble, but for that you have to have sufficient battery power to energize for that part of the time that it fails. It also means that you transport less over shorter distances using least life cycle cost technologies and intelligently exchange. So we need to build in methods of say time of day tariff, which will allow us to say um, we will not allow you to say switch on your washing machines in the day because it's a guzzler of water and energy, but we will charge you a lower rate if you do it in the night, and you can program your washing machine to do it like that, and therefore have your clothes ready for hanging out in the morning. So that's the kind of thinking that went into making this DNA, and these are the 6 ideas that grew up of how we would be able to create this near zero water and net zero energy campus. This DNA produces an organism. Of course, it doesn't at all look like the DNA because the DNA was that diagram that will show the interconnections, the logical connections, and this is a physical diagram. And this is the final master plan as it emerged, not in 2012, but later. Things were changed a bit after we started working with the campus. And this is how it works. Um, you see, for example, you see the clusters here. So this is a blow up of the 2 large clusters in the middle, which you see in the top left. And the cluster which is bermed has 3 zones: faculty residences, academic zone, and hostel zone. And you can see that while the hostel zone and faculty residences were on separate sides of the academic zone, partly because they both had to walk to the academic zone in the shortest possible time, so 10 minutes became the governing principle, but also partly because in a charrette that we did with more than 75 students and some faculty, everybody, the faculty as well as the students, wanted to be far away from each other. It was funny, but anyway, this was not our original design. But since it was very clear that the students did not want to be near the faculty and the faculty did not want to be near the students for reasons of their own, we decided that this is probably the best way to play it out. On the top, you see the technology cluster. There is nobody who lives there. It will become, you could say, dark in the night, except that there are so many labs which will work 24 hours that it will also remain active. Uh, and this is the phasing. You can see that the phasing creates somewhat, but not completely dense settlements at each phase. In the final phase, the master plan phase 5 on the right, of course, it's a fully dense settlement. In between, it is somewhat less dense than you would have liked it to be. This was partly because the institute did not want to repurpose a building. We had earlier suggested that we just build from the south to the north and say the library building would be built now, and if it is not required fully, it would be used as say a chemistry building, and later on when the chemistry building would be built, people would move there and then this would be used as a full library. Institute did not accept this idea of people moving even during a vacation. For example, a girls' hostel could become a boys' hostel or vice versa. That also was found to be not an acceptable way of working, and therefore we had to do a slight compromise so that phase 1 and 2 and 3 are somewhat clustered but not really fully clustered. But by phase 4 and 5, the whole master plan is quite densely clustered. At the end, I'd like to just reiterate that there are various ways of looking at the overall aspect of sustainability and settlements. And initially, we could see that this was done in 1971 by Ulrich and Holdren, who are two ecologists. They related the ecological impact and resources of a settlement of the whole Earth as well on the Earth. So it's called the IPAT identity, and it is called that because it's I'm stuck here. No, I close this PPC box. Since that time I'm stuck. Just hang on a minute. I'll be back. Yeah. Okay. Works now.
Yeah.
So. So Elric and Holdren related the ecological concept as I is equal to PAT, and it simply meant that the impact of human activities is equal to the population times the affluence times the technology. And it is conceived of like a cube in which, or a cuboid in which P, A, T are three sides, and I is the total volume of the cube, of the cuboid. And this, of course, is what it means. Affluence simply means the level of consumption, and technology means the amount of resources required to produce what is consumed. So, this used to be argued initially for containing population in the 1970s, and within the same year, this same identity was used by a colleague of Elric and Holdren, commoner, and he focused on changing technology to reduce impact. So he said, well, this doesn't mean that population should be limited. This means that we should make technology so much better that we are able to do more with less. And nobody, of course, talked about affluence at that stage, but everybody did accept that impact has to be reduced, human impact has to be reduced. We must not forget that late 60s and early 70s were a time of huge pollution impact on human societies and systems and ecological systems produced by mainly the chemical industry in the USA with a lot of pollution talk and so on. And so this was a result of that early work. Now the complexity of this equation, so-called equation or identity, is that the I, P and A and T are all functions of each other. So I depends on P, A, T, that's clear, but A depends on I, P and T, and P depends on I, A and T, and T depends on I, P and A. So it's quite complicated to actually work out these things, and all of them are slippery and are not measurable. Now, over the years, this has converted into what could be called in carbon terms as a similar identity called by Khosla and Khosla, called C dash is equal to IC into IE into IS into P minus S. And before I lose you, let me tell you what these terms stand for. I seem to have again lost the ability to. Yeah. So this is what it means. So total emissions, total carbon emissions, is equal to IC, the carbon produced or emissions produced per unit resource. Just read resource instead of energy. Per unit resource expended, which means that if you are using solar energy, then there's almost no carbon, and nuclear energy, then again there's no carbon. But if you're using fossil fuels, then there's a large amount of carbon produced. And this can apply not just to energy, but to any resource, water, and energy, and materials, and so on. And then into IE. So IE is the amount of resource required to provide a unit of service. Now, what's the unit of service? Unit of service is that I need to travel 100 kilometers every day to commute to work. That's a unit of service. Or unit of services, I need to buy 20 new trousers every year. A unit of services that I need to live in a house of 10,000 square feet, in a family of 2 or 3 or 4. A unit of services that I need to travel so much, and all that I've already said. So these are all consumption parameters. Then multiplied by IS, which is service per unit population. So amount of service per head is what this actually comes to. Therefore, service by population into energy by service into carbon by energy as the units of energy, except that it needs energy per unit population. And then when you multiply it by the total human population, you get total carbon or energy, right? And then there is something that nature can do, which is it can reduce the total amount of carbon and it can sink some amount, let's say in the deep sea and in new growth forest and so on and so forth. So there is a carbon sink. It's a small term, but it's there. So the strategic options that are now thrown up by this method are that you can have more forests and create, say, algae and stuff like that for carbon sink. You can reduce population, which wasn't a very popular choice in the 1970s, 80s, but has now become relevant when the same Khosla have worked out that providing television in slums might be the way to reduce fertility rates of people, and therefore every avoided human being born has a certain carbon footprint which is avoided. So, well, that's also there, depending on how you want to look at it. But it also has these three possible strategies that you can have. I'm going to come to sufficiency lifestyle last. You can have more efficiency. That is to say, you can use lesser resource for providing the same amount of service. Uh, More kilometers per liter of petrol, um, more flushing per liter of water, and so on, whatever it is. You can also have a decarbonization. So on the left, I see substitution. So the term is substitution. So you can substitute conventional resources which cause fossil fuel usage and therefore carbon emissions with those kinds of resources that can substitute for them, such as using solar energy instead of fossil energy, such as using rainwater instead of fossil water, groundwater, such as using, say, secondary soil instead of primary soil or fired bricks or something like that, or using bamboo instead of steel. So you can substitute materials which are lower in their embodied energy and lower in their carbon intensity. Lastly, the sufficiency lifestyle, the blue cloud that you see somewhere in the middle. See, this is something that is unpopular, but I believe personally that this is central to the way that sustainability will be delivered. I believe that it will not be possible to deliver sustainability if we want to consume 135 liters of water per capita per day. We will not be able to deliver sustainability if we want to produce, we want to consume 300, 400 kilowatt hours per square meter per year of energy and live in a conditioned environment. And we will not be able to produce sustainability if we demand to live in 1,000 square feet per person of house size. And if we want to travel 100 kilometers every day to commute to work. But we will be able to deliver it if we can live closer to work, if we can live in smaller houses, if we can manage with lesser amount of fresh water, and we can manage with smaller quantities of energy, partly as a service, but partly through efficiency and substitution also. So they all work together. The ICIEIS all work together, and this equation or identity used to be used to debate improvement, sufficiency, efficiency, and substitution. But look at the way that it can be used. Again, I think I've lost the ability to change.
Right click and next.
Yeah. Okay. So now Bill Gates used this equation in one of his TED talks, and it is called the Zero TED Talk or something. And of course, he was giving it in the original TED and not TEDx format. And his argument was that this is an equation and you can't make IC zero because you will require some amount of emissions for whatever resource you use, and you can't make IE zero because you require some energy for anything that you want to consume, and you can't make IS zero because everybody requires something, little bit, even a very little bit. You can't make P zero because that would be a humanless Earth, and that's what we are not aiming for. And he, of course, ignored the S. He did not use the minus S term. So he said that one of these terms, IC, IE, IS, and P, has to be zero. And the only term that he saw could become zero was IC. So he said this, he used to argue for a nuclearized world. So he was at that time tending to implement a very large scale nuclearization of the world, whereby all energy will be produced with nuclear fuel, thereby creating no emissions. I have very little time left, but I'm actually kind of done. So here is the last slide which I have for today, in which this master plan got a Griha Exemplary Award 2 years ago for passive architecture design. Incidentally, it got 2 more exemplary awards last year, one for water and one for, frankly, I don't remember what it was for, but whatever it was, and renewable energy. And so the importance is not that it got these awards, but I think the most important thing about this campus is that it's in the public sector. And in the project managers are CPWD, who most architects will roll their eyes and feel that they are the most conservative type of engineers that populate that organization and therefore will not innovate. And it's true that on the whole, if not given the right arguments, they will not create an innovative uh, campus. But it's our job as innovative architects not only to innovate but also to codify, to refer, to compute, and to be able to convince that these are ideas that can be made to work. Thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
So, one question, I'll just go quickly in this order. What are the Johars? What are the Johars?
Okay, the Johars was the original name. Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay, the Johars was the original name that we gave to the cluster, the settlements that you see as the central idea of the master plan. Johars originally in North India are meant to be a kind of traditional water holes where water collects. So they are the low-lying areas in a village, and typically they are used for water collection, very rarely for sewage disposal, but also for bathing cattle and so on and so forth.
So next question is, are there any, are the terraces being used for any gardens, open public spaces, etc.?
Are the terraces being used for any gardens, open spaces, etc.? No, actually the amount of insulation that was demanded would make gardens on terraces almost impossible to do. And this is one innovation with which we felt that our government clients were going to be unable to carry out. In a parallel project that I'm doing in South India, however, we will be putting in a lot of terrace farming and terrace vegetation. So yes, it was an idea that was considered but was not carried out.
Okay. Then what kind of wall sections and what materials have been used for wall and roof?
Can Tanmay be heard, or should I repeat this? Okay, Tanmay can be heard. What kind of wall and roof sections?
Yeah.
So the roof sections were load-bearing structure for residential areas and frame structure for institutional areas. And the load-bearing structure was such that the inside was the load-bearing wall, and then there was insulation, and the outside was a cladding, hold your breath, of 75 thick Jodhpur stone, interlocking in such a way that it would act like a dry cladding practically, and resting on cantilevered bits of slab coming out at each floor. A similar development, but in frame structure, was done for the institutional area. The roof was easier. In both cases, they are concrete slabs, and over the slab there is, I think, waterproofing followed by insulation, or maybe it's slope, then insulation, and then a finishing layer, which is finally white. The one thing that did not happen very well was a continuity of insulation between wall and roof. So there is possibly a small thermal bridging that is happening there.
Okay, one question about water. How was the water demand calculated for the green spaces and the trees and the forests of the future? Also, was there any method to relate green spaces with per person or population predicted?
Yes, required. It's a very good question. The way we've been doing it for campuses is that instead of calculating the requirement of irrigation, we tell our landscape architects that we will give you whatever we can give you, and you better design your vegetation to be acceptable in those conditions. Which doesn't mean lush green grass. It doesn't, because lush green grass requires 6 or 7 of rain every day, or or equivalent water amount, 6 or 7 liters per square meter, to keep it that lush green. But what it does mean is that soil moisture over a period of years is enhanced. And that is really the idea. So you see, when you walk around in the campus, you don't see brambles anymore, but you do see grasses starting to take root in 2-3 years that it's been now occupied for a year or a year and a half. And therefore, you see how the that the water requirement works like this. You take white water, use it for washing and human consumption, and then you create grey water out of it. You then typically you don't separate it with the black water. You do allow it to be merged with the black water. The black and the grey water go into, in this case, decentralized waste treatment system, and typically 80-90% of that water comes out. It goes back into the flush tanks, and or it goes into cooling towers, because we insisted on efficient water cooled central air conditioning plant rather than inefficient air cooled decentralized window units and small AC units. And then whatever we are left with is used for irrigation. Typically, this means irrigation is 1/6 of a 5-star hotel, or sometimes even 1/10, depending on how to compute it. But in a water short area like Jodhpur, it's too bad. You just say, well, that's the amount there is, and we better make the maximum use of it. So in the Jodhpur IIT campus, we simply worked with 1 or 1.5, I think, liters per square meter per day, which was available after recycling. So we did not add any white water to the irrigation needs.
One more question, which is about, was there any life cycle cost consideration in the design or in the overall selection of products and materials?
And another very good question. It wasn't very well done. So there was a general sense of life cycle cost when selecting materials, but it was more intuitive rather than rigorous, and therefore the overall system suffers from that deficiency.
Then, what are the alternatives to air conditioning, especially when it is hot or hot and humid climate? And has there what method has been used to naturally keep the campus cool?
Well, natural cooling of campus has been accomplished by light color, by insulation, by shading, by orientation, which are all the classical 4 methods for reducing the amount of energy required to keep it cool. But it would still mean that with a temperature average of 30, maybe 32 outside, you would get an average temperature of 34 inside, which is pretty uncomfortable and unworkable. So the air conditioning which has been provided with the huge amount of insulation is of a fairly low level. For example, a ton of air conditioning in the institutional area, if memory serves me right, serves some 300 square feet or 400 square feet of space. And that's pretty good considering that, say, in Bombay, it would be used for 150 square feet. For, of course, I admit a denser population. So when we say we first demand less, this is how we demand less. And it doesn't mean that we have done life cycle costing analysis of the insulation. We just use durable materials for the embodied stuff and low maintenance systems for the operating stuff.
Another interesting question. Can you elaborate on how do you integrate a modern energy intensive material like XPS and insulation with traditional materials of Jodhpur? And how does a campus like this address issues of social sustainability? So two things, one about materials.
So the XPS is an industrial and a kind of, let's say, foreign material. And it isn't easy to work out construction detail. It required a lot of man hours to work out the possible construction details that would allow all our thermal constraints to be met, as well as constructability, doability, legality, and a reasonable amount of craft, which was still retained. So the answer really, I can't give you a very great answer. It isn't easy, but you just have to do it off the seat of your pants, as it were. Social sustainability, I tried to explain, was done, depends a lot on the institute himself, I mean the director typically. The first director had done this workshop, which was fantastic, about jutis made by local leather workers working in tandem with 3D printers and engineers who were being trained in textile engineering and apparel design. So that was interesting. But subsequently, the directors have their own views on what aspects of social sustainability they would encourage. What we did manage to do was to identify a location and do a rough plan for a workers' housing, which, because more than 300 to 500 workers would be required to stay at any time during the construction of this campus. And obviously, they also would need to follow the sustainability guidelines of zero energy and zero waste production and so on. So their waste has to be composted, their toilets have to be designed in a way that they don't require too much water and so on. How much was done is a function of whether the various contractors accepted the rent agreements with the institute. I must say they did not. So what really happened was that these remained as suggested designs, which were not necessarily followed, but at least the area was used.
Then some other domains. One question is, what method was used to reduce carbon footprint for transport?
The whole campus is a walkable campus, and whatever petrol cars or ICE cars come in from outside are given a generous car parking space where they can transfer onto an e-buggy. There is now talk going on of actually purchasing these buggies and so on, and we have provided for charging of electrical vehicles throughout the campus. So I guess the emissions on road at least would be very low. And since most of the electricity is solar electricity, the emissions would be practically nil.
Okay. Then a few people have asked a question about Where can they get more details of the project? Are the details, pictures, photographs, and other things available? Also, one question: are there any third-party or post-occupancy studies planned for actually evaluating the performance?
So let me answer it backwards. The third-party studies, if any, are not planned. I mean, there is a 6-monthly report given to MOEF for meeting the necessary compliances of the EIA approval that was obtained, but the institute doesn't really plan to have anything more than a bare minimum, uh, which effectively means that we won't have really a lot of post-occupancy studies, I think. A lot of students have written a little bit on Twitter and various websites on whether they like the campus or not. On the whole, fairly positive reviews. Some maintenance people have talked anecdotally, let's say, about the ease of maintenance through a service tunnel that runs through the entire campus and serves to provide the chilled water and the various grades of water and the electrical services and the data services that service all the buildings. So it's a plug and play campus. And what were the earlier questions?
The more information about the project.
More information about the project. I frankly don't know. I will have to discuss this and see how much of this can be made available
On IIT Jodhpur website.
So there is some amount on IIT Jodhpur website and it's continuing to grow. And I suppose that will really be the primary source of information on this campus.
So another question about the domain. What's the role of an architect per se in deciding and driving a project or design towards net zero?
Well, if the architects in this whole game had not been briefed by us and if they had chosen not to follow the precepts that we had laid out, we would have
as an
had
architect.
me as an architect.
Like not
Well,
just in
I
general,
don't consider
architects.
myself an architect. I consider myself an engineer who happens to have an architectural degree. And to that extent,
For a project, what's the architect's role in going net zero versus technology? This basically design versus technology.
Okay, let's put it this way: if architecture consists of a technology which organizes space, clearly there is a space for an architect to work with net zero projects because you would not have a project unless it was also spatially laid out. So when it comes to optimizing travel distances or thinking about creating a dense settlement and still managing to get um, the ambulances and the fire tenders in, that's a very architectonic approach, right? I mean, not very many professionals would be able to do it, not even engineers. But if you were to look at the way that energy or water consumption has been limited or made sufficient, you could argue that that's not really the job of an architect. It happens to be the job of myself as a person who's interested in sustainability. And incidentally, the RFP which appointed us was not the RFP for an architect. It required the leader to have an architectural degree, but it never appointed the campus master planner as an architect. It appointed a campus master planner. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. One statement you made that every consumer must be a producer in the context of an educational campus. So just a little bit of elaboration. What does it actually mean for a net zero project?
I don't know if you've heard of smart grids, but basically in a country like Denmark, you have over 1 million people producing electricity, just as you have maybe 10 million consuming it, or maybe a little bit more. Practically every house has a small amount of solar collectors on its roof. Now imagine the potential of aggregation of all these small numbers into millions and millions of kilowatt hours. This is made possible with modern AI and technological improvements because you say that, well, once upon a time it was impossible to gather together and synchronize anything more than 2 or 3 sources of electricity, but today it's possible to get millions of small producers to pile together and produce that electricity. Therefore, you have what are called net meters today, which effectively create a smart grid out of our national grid. In other words, somebody producing electricity in, say, Tamil Nadu can be producing electricity which is consumed in, say, Mizoram by a farmer. Now, that is the whole new world that we are progressing towards. And if we pool our resources like that, there are bound to be places which are cloudy on a certain day, but the sunny portions of the nation can therefore produce excess electricity or resources or whatever that's required. And so every consumer has to become a producer, and that doesn't necessarily negate the role of the utility, but it definitely reduces its requirements for meeting every peak demand. So instead of looking at, say, 10 major power plants servicing an entire nation, we are now looking at a million or a billion small units over rooftops. So all combining together.
Last 2 questions. One, what is the, how is the gray and black water being treated? How are they being treated? And what specific technology is being used on the campus?
So the gray and black water, they're two separate questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are they being segregated?
No, I already explained that the gray and black water is not being segregated in order to save ourselves the hassle of having 2 sets of manholes and pipes. But they are brought together as sewage into what is called a decentralized waste treatment system, which consists of a baffle tank, which is a primary settler. A settler followed by a baffle tank, which is a primary, what's it called, decomposition device, a primary composting device, followed by a planted bed filter. So a planted bed filter is the key technology which is being used. The cam has been closed by organizer.
That's it.
Okay, does it matter?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but this blue light also ran.
Yeah. So we can hear.
Okay. So the DWATS technology has been pioneered in Bremen in Germany and brought by various organizations, primarily the Center for Development of DWATS Technology, CTD, in Bangalore. But it's also propagated this technology through various other NGOs such as Honarshala, Auroville Foundation, and so on. And this technology has been utilized now by organizations such as Center for Science and Environment and a variety of other organizations all over India. Now, what are the disadvantages? I think the primary disadvantage of the DWATS technology is that it requires a lot more space than an electromechanical STP. It requires 2 square meters per person, which is a hell of a lot of area, which we happen to have, so we could use it. But there is a secondary disadvantage, which is that if and when it fails, meaning that when it is smelling bad, you need to sort it out by calling somebody who can actually work out how to sort it out, as opposed to an STP plant, which is an electromechanical device. So when it fails, there is a sense of greater relief because you can shout at somebody after calling them up and say, this pump has failed, repair it, replace it with another pump, or this whatever, this electric device has failed or this mechanical device has failed, and so on and so forth. So this is funny, but the primary problem with DWATS technology is that it requires no maintenance. I'm calling it a problem because it's often the reason why engineers do not like to use DWATS technologies, and it has been a major problem trying to get the institute to accept it. I would even argue that they haven't implemented it very well, so there's a tendency for it to create a little bit of not very well treated water. But finally, if you want to make this water fit for drinking, then you can basically after the secondary treatment of the plant bed filter, it will contain some E. coli, which is the gut bacteria. And all you need to do finally is to either ozonize it or to put it through a UV filter, or the more natural way, which is used in Auroville, is to make a pond with this water flows and the sun shines on it, and the sun is a denaturing agent and will kill the bacteria. So that's the technology used. What other?
Last question is, can net zero concept be used in low budget projects like sun upgradation and low cost housing?
I believe it can be used in low cost housing. Yes, I mean, we had the luxury of working with, in theory, an unlimited budget, meeting the requirements of an institute like IIT, which is well funded. But the way it would work in low cost projects, it would be very different. You would stress much more on sufficiency. You probably would not require such projects to have a lot of consumption of energy for air conditioning, for a start. So you would already define it as much less energy consumption, and in all likelihood, you would have to make innovative methods of financing. So, for example, it's possible, even if you have no money at all, to get, say, a foreign investor to invest in a rooftop solar collector system, as long as you can agree to pay that person the cost of whatever electricity you use, and allow that person to sell the remainder which you produce at non-peak times into the grid. So there are innovative mechanisms that are developing. This is called an ESCO kind of proposal, where the energy is not being supplied by the utility in effect, but by your energy services company or ESCO. So these things can be done, and this can be done for water as well. There are WSCOs now operating in the US, and these kinds of companies can probably start existing in India too, so that they take care of low-cost projects and they replace a tap with a more efficient tap at their own cost. Because like telephones used to be once upon a time, the telephone was owned by the telephone company. Landlines are still like that. Well, not always, but often are like that. The Bakelite ones anyway were. And therefore, the company had the right to change it whenever better designs came along. So in a similar way, that's the kind of innovation you need to work out when it comes to low cost. But I believe it can be done.
Okay. The final question from my side, knowing you, in a lighter vein or maybe a serious vein, in terms of lifestyle, what would be your advice to somebody seeking net zero in terms of fashion, clothing, food, and lifestyle for net zero?
So this is a tough one, because this is a classical question about, are we doing without? Is 28 uncomfortably warm? It can be if you are having a menopause or you happen to be completely acclimatized to a 24-degree environment and so on. But new research is showing us that 28 plus minus 1 is absolutely comfortable, especially if you allow yourself a ceiling fan. Is walking 10 minutes to work uncomfortable because you need the right to be able to drive to Jodhpur 23 kilometers away? Well, yes and no. That's up to you to decide whether you consider yourself deprived because you are walking to work, or whether you consider yourself privileged that you are being able to walk to work in 10 minutes.
What about clothing and food?
Clothing and food. Now, in food, the primary ingredient that goes into food is not even energy but water. 85% of India's freshwater resources go into producing our food. And this would be much less if a lot more of us would not drink coffee, which I drink, I'm afraid, and would not eat meat, especially red meat. And I mean, the only thing is that if you eat imported meat, you're not doing such a bad job, because you're taking New Zealand's rain and feeding that into yourself rather than Indian rain. But this kind of started explaining to me why India, and especially in desert areas, are essentially vegetarian societies. It clearly did not make sense to be able to rear goat or any other animal for meat. Uh, in fact, when I discovered these numbers in the early 2000s, I have myself turned vegetarian, though as I admit I still drink coffee. So not all is good, and I still have occasionally refined sugar, but I rarely have it now. So these are some of the bad ones as far as food
I'm
choices.
not wearing a suit now.
I'm also not wearing a suit, but that I wasn't wearing before also. Um, I stayed in an ashram in the 1990s, and that's where I learned that when it comes to food choices or clothes choices, it makes sense to live in a 31, 32-degree environment and eat non-spicy food, drink lots of water, keep a cool mind through maybe meditation, and wear loose cotton clothes. And all these contributed to your being allowed to live in an environment of 30. But to also see that since everybody around you as a whole society was doing the same, see it as a notion of privilege rather than one of deprivation. And that's a difficult one because people who talk the deprivation language are pro-choice. So they're saying, oh, I should have the choice to wear a three-piece suit in a temperature of 28, and that I can't do. I need 22, therefore. But that's a choice that is even being people like in Singapore, they're turning back on that choice. So you would find that in Japan and Singapore, and Japan also has a fairly hot season for the southern island of I think Kyushu or whatever the island is called. And they have now in their government instituted this practice of wearing Okinawa shirts, that is loose cotton shirts, and and keeping the temperatures to 28 plus minus 1. So if a so-called advanced country like Japan can do it, and Singapore also have done doing this, it doesn't encourage three-piece suits in their banking system anymore as a fashion statement. I think we should be able to do a pro-choice within limited amounts of uh, choices that we can see as good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, SB,
Thank you.
for the clear and concise presentation, and also to take all the questions as well. We are slightly 5 minutes over time, and that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much once again for your time and being part of this webinar. And just the one final thing, if to all our attendees, if you haven't signed up yet on our Net Zero Energy website, then please do so now. All the upcoming events and all the different case studies about that you're actually listening to on the webinar, you can find it on our website, and as well as different information to do with net zero energy buildings. We will see you next week with another great session. Thank you very much for attending.